Hello, welcome to today's webinar. This is the third webinar in the series of practical data governance, and it's called Staying Ahead. We're going to look at some strategies and practices that will help organizations stay ahead in the realm of data governance and cybersecurity. My name is James Mace, and I'm a principal consultant at WM Reply, based out of our London office, and I'm joined by my colleague Rob Parle, who is a senior M365 consultant out of our Chester office. As I mentioned, this is webinar 3. In the first couple webinars, just before we dive into today's agenda, we've covered kind of the why data governance matters, where we looked at the definition of risk and compliance. We also looked at what data governance actually means. In the second webinar, we talked about building the framework. We talked about why ownership is important. So we talked about platform governance, and then actually looking at a tool like Microsoft Purview to implement a framework. So if you haven't seen those, check those out on our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to look at a couple other things that we haven't really dived into in detail. So securing your organization and building that resilience. We're going to look at how compliance should be a life cycle and the path forward kind of thing, right? So these aren't one-time activities, and so we want to treat it as a life cycle. So with that, let's get going with our first section, securing your organization. So something that we haven't really talked about a whole lot is the users that are sort of part of the overall sort of data governance and framework, right? We've talked about the framework itself. We've talked about ownership. We've talked about a lot of other things, but there's also the user aspect. We're going to touch on a few different things relating to the users in this webinar today. First aspect is just reviewing some of the basics of cybersecurity that users generally need to be aware of. Later on, we're going to talk about sort of training and adoption and that kind of stuff. But it's very important that your users kind of understand cyber threats and how to identify them and what they are. And there's a couple identified on the screen here, such as phishing, malware, the social engineering threats. Is actually quite a lot, and there's more that we can talk about, but that's not the purpose of this. What we want to understand here is that it's not just the ownership, it's not just the framework, it's not just the tools like sensitivity labels and retention labels. It's also important that the users actually understand what's going on. We're going to talk a lot about the users' involvement as we go along here. Okay, so it's essentially kind of a team effort is really the messaging that we're looking at here, right? We want to protect sensitive information from oversharing. Now, Rob did go into this in a previous webinar, but just to review a little bit, we want to look at access control measures, right? We want everything to be generally role-based access control, also using technologies such as just-in-time access. So that might be where your admins don't always have full access to a system, but they're given enough access to do the job they need, and then that access is removed, right? It's just additional layers to help prevent access to sensitive data. Employee education is a big thing. We're going to touch on that a little later, as I mentioned, right? We need that training to go so they understand policies and all that sort of thing. We're also going to talk about monitoring and audits and the importance of that life cycle approach as we go along as well. And just making sure there's clear established guidelines for users is quite important as well. As much as we want the technology to be automated, if we can, right, through the use of maybe provisioning portals or labels that get applied automatically, we still need some guidelines for the users so they know kind of what to do and maybe what not to do. Right. Moving on. Excuse me. So really, we're kind of talking about collaboration across teams, and more importantly, secure collaboration across all your teams, right? So again, protecting sensitive information, that generally might mean that you're using something like sensitivity labels to apply to sites and content and that sort of thing. But it's also important that you've got secure communication channels. Now, this is a topic we haven't really dived into a whole lot, but everything we've been talking about in previous webinars and in this webinar is really setting up the tools and the training for users so that whether if you're using something like M365, for example, your Teams and your SharePoint and your Outlook are all secure, right? And they're all sort of official communication channels. One we haven't really touched on is shadow IT. So shadow IT is where users end up using unofficial communication tools, right, or applications, right? So that can be anything from perhaps something like WhatsApp to maybe different AI tools that are out there, such as ChatGPT, that may not be official communication channels. And the reason that those aren't official is because generally they're going to lack all of the framework that we've been talking about. They're not going to have the sensitivity labels. They're not going to have the retention labels. They're not going to have proper control over your organization's data. Okay, so everything that we're working towards is trying to produce this, secure set of communication channels. And you can think of it as two extremes. On one hand, if there's no framework and no labels and you're very early in that journey, users might just sort of be using whatever tool they kind of wish, and there's no restriction, and there's a lot of potential data loss and a huge risk there. Conversely, you could go so far the other way that you've got so much protocols and so much policies and so many labels and so much restriction on the actual use of the tools that the user get frustrated and then end up going and seeking other tools that are easier for them to use. So it is kind of about finding a little bit of a balance between kind of that automation and security and labels and that kind of stuff, and user effectiveness sort of thing, right? That being said, you're always going to want that training and awareness programs, right? So that users are aware of your governance plan and governance strategies. And previously, in a previous webinar, we spoke about leadership and accountability. It is vitally and important that your leadership is playing an important role in setting expectations, using the same tools, following the same policies and procedures, and so that the whole organization is, collaborating and making sure the data is protected. Okay. At this point, I'll hand over to Rob to talk us through building resilience.
Thank you, James. So yeah, in this section, I'm going to be talking through three key pillars. First off, we'll be talking about sort of incident response planning, sort of preparing for the unexpected. And then we'll talk about auditing and compliance checks. And then sort of really going into detail, that last point by James there, in terms of more of that adoption angle, sort of those training and awareness programs. So when we talk about resilience, one of the most important areas to focus on is, as I said, is that incident response planning. So this is really about trying to prepare for the unexpected, things like data breaches, phishing attacks, accidental data exposure, stuff that we've discussed in our first webinar. It's not just about, is it a matter of if something goes wrong, but maybe the perspective to look at it from a planning perspective is when it may go wrong, so that we want our organization to be able to respond quickly and effectively even when that incident occurs. So to break this down a bit, we start with that first bullet point there, the importance of an incident response. And that's because without that plan in place, it can be quite difficult to react. But with that solid plan, sort of making sure that your teams know who to be coordinating with, how do we contain the issue, how do we recover faster from that potential breach, then quite importantly, we can sort of avoid the risk of that less potential damage to the organization. So this isn't just producing that plan for our IT team. It's about bringing together legal, comms, the HR teams, the governance teams, all the people that we were talked about in those roles and responsibilities in our second webinar. How can we make sure that those teams are best prepared? And then second, we have, identifying those potential threats. We even touched on that first section there by James, things like oversharing, data sprawl, even AI misuse. our response plan that we have in place should be able to reflect those real risks that apply to our organization specifically. But also, quite importantly, we need to be thinking about keeping that updated, as maybe new potential risks or threats, emerge in the world, in the landscape. We need to be updating our plan to reflect that. And then we also have establishing those clear response protocols. So that's outsetting very clearly in our plan. How do we, what happens in the incident, when an incident occurs? Who do we need to be making sure is alerted? Do we need to shut down certain systems? What sort of communications get sent to, and when does that happen? I think the more vague that we leave that plan, the more chance that we can lose some, pretty valuable time if an incident did occur. And then finally, it's not just enough just to draft a plan and then let it sit there until that, that rare chance of an incident occurring. We also need to be trying to, test it and maybe updating it quite regularly. If we test our plan, we can potentially spot some flaws in, in the process that we've identified before, the real thing potentially does happen down the line. And also, if we are updating it regularly, it can be proved quite vital if we have, maybe new members of the team that join, potentially our IT or our governance roles, potentially a change of roles or a change of staff positions. That then reduces the chances of leaving ourselves exposed, maybe a lack of knowledge within those teams. So moving on to the next section, regular audits and compliance checks. So we have our incident plan in place. The next part about building that resilience is about being pretty proactive within those teams. That means, regular audits and compliance checks where and when possible. So first off, from maybe more of a legal and regulatory compliance perspective, those regular audits can confirm that our organization's data is aligning with our internal policies. There's external requirements that might be set, against us by different bodies. It's not just about doing things like avoiding fines. Again, we've discussed this. It's about showing, the process that we follow as an organization, showing that due diligence, but then also being pretty considerate on how things which are pretty stringent, third-party regulations like GDPR, we need to potentially stay on top of that, as an organization. And then secondly, we have exposing those process gaps and then improving those operations. That's about, if we can, by doing those audits, they can give us that visibility into, what are we working on, and what isn't working within our organization. Maybe a process is outdated or controls within the business aren't being followed correctly. By completing that audit, it can bring those things to light, which I think can be quite a positive thing, and that it then allows us to, improve those processes internally before that incident happens, and we need to try and implement our incident plan. And then last on this section, we have reducing the risk and strengthens oversight. So, by completing those two activities, we can do that, but it's not just about, tick box exercise. It's about trying to create that culture of awareness, about accountability. We're going to be talking about this in that training and awareness programs. It's about making sure that we can try to catch our problems early, enhance our efficiency, but making sure that, for our organization, we are aware that, our governance and our data's information is sort of a part of everyone's role, within our teams. So in short, just to sort of sum up there, those two first activities, trying to treat it like a routine checkup, even though, part of it isn't just to look at the problems. It's about trying to create that sort of healthy framework, which can be, I guess, aligned to our business process, when we change as an organization. So then, sort of to try and bring together that resilience section here, and we talked about training and awareness, I think, in all of our webinars so far. To sort of maybe try to delve a little bit more detail. We're trying to, as you can see from that first section there, that empowering and knowledgeable workforce. Even the best systems that we use as an organization, people aren't using them correctly, or maybe aren't equipped to, make the best decisions when using them, and that can potentially be a risk. Having that strong training program can help build out our teams to be pretty data savvy, allows them to, recognize those risks, respond appropriately. Maybe even a perfect world, it might allow that to happen, and maybe even prevent incidents from happening in that first place, through those having that information within our workforce and within our teams. That can be done through a few different ways, right? So, I think first off, we have those interactive learning opportunities. That isn't, training, I don't think is a one size fits all. There should be different ways that we can try and empower those teams. That might be things like workshops, maybe even, online seminars, where we try to bring our teams together, allow them to explore what our expectations are for them to do within their role specifically. And that might differ from person to person. And we also need to try and explore what options are going to work for us as a business. For some that might be face-to-face, in person, but for maybe trying to work at scale, that might be things like e-learning. It could be online modules. Can we try to provide accessible, consistent messaging throughout our organization that everyone can always sort of see and is readily available to them? Can we try and give them an opportunity to take that information that we're giving them and apply it to their day-to-day roles and their day-to-day business tasks? And then lastly, training content can expire in some ways. I think when I talk about keeping up with the change, it kind of means keeping pace, right? So having to refresh our training content pretty regularly, and that might mean updating it to reflect regulatory changes. It could be that there might be a new sort of threat type which didn't exist in the past. I think things like AI could be pretty relevant here. Trying to update our training to be applicable to the current day and age. It might even be that we may have learned something from a previous incident, instead of applying that to our future training. So it's sort of always up to date for our colleagues. I think is super important. So then again, just to try and summarize the training and awareness programs, it isn't just about sort of saying, pushing our users to an online webpage which says, here are our policies, here are our systems. It's about instead, can we empower them? Can we give them the information, the knowledge, so that they would then feel pretty confident that they are using and working with their organization's data correctly and sort of as risk averse as possible.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, so section 3, we're now going to talk about the compliance lifecycle. This is all about sort of continuous improvement, right? We've talked a lot about framework and ownership and platform governance and that kind of stuff, and we've tried to iterate along the way to remind people that it's not just a one-time thing. So we're going to look at what it means to sort of monitor, measure, and adapt and staying ahead of regulatory changes, that sort of stuff. So, so on the subject of monitoring, measuring, and adapting, we want to look at a couple things, right? So we want to monitor our processes, right? And we start by kind of, a regular review process of identifying inefficiencies and areas for improvement within an organization. At the same time, you also kind of want to measure performance, right? You need to understand, sort of establish some benchmarks and understand how your users and how as an organization you're evaluating against the effectiveness of achieving your business goals, right? Then you want to take that information that you've learned from that analysis and use it to update and adapt your strategies, right? So it's very hard to understand if your strategies are actually working very well without doing that, measuring the performance. But once you do, you then need to sort of go and look and see where you could improve and where you could adopt new strategies, especially since compliance is something that changes quite a bit. There's new and updated compliance regulations on a daily basis. So it's something you need to stay ahead of. And then lastly, fostering a culture of improvement. Rob just talked about a whole bunch of different things about involving the users. We've mentioned a lot of technical stuff on the framework and that sort of thing in the previous webinars, but it really is making sure that the entire organization has this feeling of being involved and wanting your users to be able to sort of innovate and strive for excellence in their work and being part of that culture. So one of the key things when we talk about compliance, and I mentioned this already, is it changes, daily. I think there's a statistic out there of about 200 or 300 new or updated changes on a daily basis concerning all sorts of regulatory, laws, rules, everything from GDPR to, government rules and regulations and everything in between. So you're going to want to establish some sort of process of proactive monitoring, right? So you don't want to wait until something has changed, or you don't want to wait until something has changed and not realize it and have the impact kind of affect you down the road. So you want to be actively monitoring those laws and compliance regulations that change, right? Then with that information, when you know something is new or has changed, you need to assess the implications of that change, right? So this assessment then lets you sort of figure out, is it something that you need to be concerned with? Maybe it's a regulation change that doesn't affect your business, for example, but maybe it is. And so you need to sort of kind of get a gauge of that implication, the impact that it might have on the organization and what to do about it. So then that leads us to implementing any adjustments that you might need to do, right? Now, this could be adjusting policies, adjusting procedures. It could be everything from tweaking sensitivity labels or retention labels that you have in place, DLP policies. Could be tweaking some of the governance model that we talked about on the platform governance. It could be a variety of different things that you need to look at within the framework and the platform governance that you might need to tweak and update. This whole process in most organizations is usually quite manual, right? There's so much information out there. It's in different places, different sources, databases, online resources, websites, etc. It can be really hard to stay ahead of. And most organizations, are probably a bit more reactive to this, where something changes and then they, it has an impact or something happens and they need to sort of figure out what to do about it and repair the damage. So if you have a team that can look at this sort of stuff from a manual perspective, that's let's say the basic stage, I would say. But there are some opportunities, especially with tools like Copilot and Copilot agents specifically, or any AI tool that you have access to, where you might actually be able to put something together that can do a bit more than just relying on sort of people monitoring websites. You could have the AI agent monitor those same sources and look for new or updated regulations. But beyond that, with the power of AI, you could actually do a little bit more. You could actually have them kind of analyze what those changes are, and then figure out, based on the knowledge of your organization, what the impact might be, and then kind of raise those flags to the right people to not just say, hey, there's a new change, but hey, there's a new change, and there's a recommendation to do this with that change, change a policy or update the governance framework or whatever it might be. So there's a few different options there. Okay, so the path forward. So we're going to talk about integrating risk and compliance into your business strategy. Talk about, again, that culture of proactive risk management and really encouraging collaboration across the board to kind of bring this all together. So when we talk about integration, right, we want a sort of holistic integration approach. We want that risk and compliance kind of mindset to be integrated into every aspect of planning, so that they're not just sort of standalone functions, or they're not just owned by one or two teams, but that it's integral to your whole sort of business strategy, right? You also really want to focus on that proactive risk management, which I just talked about, but it's really getting ahead of those, identifying potential threats proactively, and then being able to address those and make changes prior to something bad happening, which is never good. And again, we're harping on this quite a lot, but collaboration and communication is a huge thing, right? And collaboration across all levels of the business. A lot of users tend to, we reviewed this in the first webinar, they don't think it's their responsibility. There's a lot of myths out there about whose role it is, and really it's everybody's role at the end of the day. So let's dive into that a little bit more. What does that mean, right? A culture of proactive risk management, right? So it's about the organization encouraging people to be proactive, right? To have that proactive mindset, right? So you want an environment where people are encouraged to anticipate risks, where they can flag emails that look suspicious. They can, maybe contribute to a Viva community or a Teams. And there's open communication is what you basically want to get from that, right? Across the board, coming from the top down or from bottom up, right? You want that sharing of knowledge and insights into what's going on within the organization and what risks there might be and how to mitigate those risks, right? And for all of that to work, you need sort of clear protocols, right? As much as we want to maybe automate the framework and use something like Purview to apply labels and apply sensitivity labels and all that kind of stuff, we do need all that user training that we talked about earlier that Rob mentioned. And we want sort of clear protocols so we know if a user has questions or doesn't know what to do, they can follow the protocols and take ownership of that risk management, basically. Okay. So it all comes down to encouraging that collaboration between IT, compliance, business teams, legal, cybersec, right, across all teams within the organization. It's hugely important that this is a collaborative effort, essentially. I mentioned insights a minute ago there, so being able to share valuable insights, right, lessons learned, what has happened, what people might need to avoid, and all, providing those insights so you can make better decisions, right, and lower the risk. Having an alignment of objectives across departments. A lot of departments have maybe a different appetite for risk or maybe their own strategies for dealing with it. And if you can, align those across the business as much as you can, it makes it a bit easier to sort of manage it from a platform perspective or to implement a framework that works across the business as far as the sort of labels and DOP policies and that sort of thing. And that speaks to a unified risk management framework is really this whole thing that we've kind of been talking about. Right? Okay. So, in conclusion, excuse me, going to back up for just a second and just remind our users about this. This is the third webinar in a series, right? So in the first webinar, we did talk about understanding the definitions of risk management and compliance and understanding what data governance actually is. In the second webinar, we looked at ownership, the importance of ownership. We looked at sort of a platform governance, which is all about sort of your governance models, support models, those policies and that kind of stuff. And then the actual governance framework, right? That was the big piece that we tackled in webinar 2. And that's really diving into a tool like Purview and implementing sensitivity labels, retention labels. It could even be potentially using something like a custom provisioning portal in conjunction with a tool like Purview. So you can do additional automation and meet additional requirements that your organization might have. Right. So then in this webinar, we've talked about, making sure users are also involved in that process and the overall sort of securing the organization, right? Preventing breaches and unauthorized access. Rob talked us through building that resilience, right? Adapting to changes, training, all of that kind of stuff, so that you can recover from potential data incidents effectively if they were to happen. And then we talked about understanding compliance and fostering collaborative culture, and really being sort of strategic in your planning and fostering an open collaborative culture within the organization. And really, this is all about effective data governance. It's a multifaceted approach. It's never a sort of one and done sort of thing where you just create some policies, do some training, and leave it. It's always kind of an ongoing, mindset that you need to have behind data governance, right? And by prioritizing all of these elements, organizations can stay ahead in an ever evolving landscape. Not only does the regulations change, but so do all the types of attacks that people are doing out there, that malicious actors might be doing. Okay. So just as we're wrapping up here, just a couple of things on how to get started with a lot of this. So we've done 3 webinars now. We've talked about a lot of information, and we have a few offerings within WM that can help organizations get started. The first is a very basic discovery piece. Okay, this is a very short, sort of a day or two amount of effort to come in, kind of review, talk with your teams, talk with legal, talk with cybersec, talk with, if you have established governance board, and kind of see where you're at in your compliance journey, and make some recommendations as to how to fill that gap. Our second, more robust offering is where we do a more full sort of discovery and design, which is where we come in, look at all the existing policies, identify new ones, identify changes, figure out, that governance framework that we talked about. And so this is really sort of designing that framework, and a design of how to implement those policies through a tool like Microsoft Purview, with labels, possibly with custom provisioning portals, and all of that training adoption that we talked about as well. This is usually followed up by sort of a second phase where you actually do the implementation and testing and deployment, and that could be a multi-phased approach, especially at large organizations that might need to phase in some of these changes over time. Third offer that we have is all about platform governance, and this is, sometimes we end up doing this first if there's no clear ownership established within the organization as to who owns this, right? Some teams might own certain bits of it, but there might not be sort of a centralized or an overarching platform governance. So this might be establishing a governance board. It'll be identifying your governance model, your support model, and then it also usually encompasses a roadmap or strategic plan of how to launch the various governance components of the framework. So sometimes this is done first, sometimes this is done in parallel to doing a discovery design of implementing the framework itself. So on that note, feel free to reach out to either myself or to Rob. Our email addresses are on the screen there. And if you have any questions or comments along this journey, feel free to get in touch and let us know if we can help in any way. Okay. Thank you for attending today's webinar. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the Q&A. So it looks like we will end it there. Thank you for attending, and good luck on your compliance journeys. Thanks.